Hi, welcome back. We are starting part 2 of our human reproductive system video. So with this section, I'm picking up where the computer shut me off yesterday and we had to leave off. And so we're going to the next slide now. It's on erection, orgasm, and ejaculation. So during sexual arousal, the parasympathetic impulses are going to trigger increased blood flow to those erectile tissues in the penis. So that is going to be that corpus spongiosum and corpora cavernosum. And so with that, it's going to send blood into that area, and as the blood goes in and fills in those open spaces, that is going to produce the erection. So the combination of sexual stimulation is orgasm, in which in the male is going to consist in emission of movement of sperm cells and accessory gland secretions into the urethra. Ejaculation occurs, and that's when it's going to force the semen to the outside portion of the body. After ejaculation, the sympathetic nervous system is going to kick in, and those impulses are going to constrict the arteries, which is going to cause the blood flow to leave those open spaces in that erectile tissue, and then the penis is going to return to its flaccid state. So, the hormone control in the male reproductive functions, the hormones are going to be secreted by the hypothalamus. Remember, that's going to be above the pituitary. The anterior pituitary is also going to be involved, and the testes, which are going to control the male reproductive development and secondary characteristics. So with the hypothalamic and pituitary hormones, at the time of puberty, the hypothalamus is going to release what's known as gonadotropin-releasing hormone. And we talked about that a little bit when we covered it in the endocrine system. This is going to trigger the production of gonadotropins. Also, it releases the luteinizing hormones and the follicle-stimulating hormones from that anterior pituitary. So what the luteinizing hormone is going to do is it's going to go to the testes, and it's going to help the development of those interstitial cells. Remember, those interstitial cells are going to be called Leydig cells, Leydig. And so those are the ones that are responsible for making and secreting testosterone. The follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, and testosterone are going to work together to stimulate spermatogenesis. That's the production, creation of sperm. Male sex hormones are going to be referred to as androgens. One of those, which is going to be the most common one that you hear about, is going to be testosterone. That is going to be found in the most abundant of all androgens in males. So testosterone is secreted in the fetus until birth. This is going to help to produce those male characteristics. Once the baby's born, it's no longer going to be produced again until puberty. After that, it is going to be continuously produced throughout that male's life. So once puberty hits, from then to the point of death, testosterone will be produced. Going into this picture, let's see if I can increase the size for you to see so we can follow the chart. So here we're going to have the hypothalamus secreting the hormone, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, at a rate that remains relatively steady. So as a result, the blood levels of FSH, LH, and testosterone are going to remain within a relatively narrow range throughout the man's reproductive life. So coming down, when stimulated, the gonadotropin-releasing hormone is going to go to the anterior lobe of the pituitary. It's going to release LH, or luteinizing hormone, and FSH, which is follicle-stimulating hormone. So let's follow to the side first. Let's go for the FSH. FSH is going to target the nurse cells. Remember, those also are referred to as Sertoli cells. Those nurse cells are going to be the seminiferous tubules. They're the ones, remember, that are going to help to take care of and to nourish the sperm that's being produced. So under the FSH stimulation with testosterone from the interstitial endocrine cells or the Leydig cells, nurse cells are going to secrete inhibin in response to factors released by developing sperm. They secrete androgen binding proteins, which are called ABP, and they promote spermatogenesis and spermiogenesis. Now, spermatogenesis is going to be the production of sperm, and then spermiogenesis is going to be the maturation of that sperm. Okay, coming down, we have our androgen binding proteins from there. They're going to bind androgens within the seminiferous tubules. This is going to increase the local concentration of androgens and stimulate the physical maturation of spermatids. So it goes from a spermatogonia or the spermatozoa, and it's going to create the spermatocytes. So you'll go to the primary spermatocytes, secondary spermatocytes, spermatids, and then sperm. And next, you have your nurse cells. They help to create the environment that facilitates both spermatogenesis and spermiogenesis. And then coming back to the secretion of luteinizing hormone, it's going to target the interstitial endocrine cells of the testes. So that's going to target the cells, the Leydig cells, which are going to make testosterone. So luteinizing hormone induces the secretion of testosterone and other androgens by the interstitial cells and that are going to be found in the testes. Remember, they're also called Leydig cells. So they're going to come down and they're going to help to maintain the libido or sex drive and behaviors. They help to stimulate bone and muscle growth. They help to establish and maintain male secondary characteristics and maintain secondary accessory glands of the reproductive system. All right, sorry. Okay, actions of testosterone. Testosterone is going to stimulate the development of male reproductive organs and cause the testes to descend. Now, at first, the testes are going to be up in the cavity of the body. They do have to come down and descend. They usually, if they haven't descended by within like the first year and a half, they will go in and do surgery on that child. Testosterone is also going to be responsible for the male secondary sexual characteristics. So once puberty kicks in, that's what's going to produce that deep voice, body hair, and thickening of the skin. Also, testosterone is going to be responsible for the development of sexual function and stimulation of anabolism, especially with protein synthesis. A negative feedback system is going to involve the hypothalamus regulating the quantity of testosterone. So high testosterone levels are going to inhibit the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone by the hypothalamus, and that's going to cause a decrease in luteinizing hormone secretions. And that in turn is going to reduce or lower the testosterone to normal levels. And so as the amount of LH drops in response, of course, testosterone is going to drop and be reduced. Now that's going to finish us up for the male reproductive system. Now we're going into the female reproductive system. So the jobs of the female reproductive system are going to be to produce and maintain the egg cell, transport these cells to the site of fertilization, provide a favorable environment for a developing fetus, and give birth and nourish the newborn, and produces the female sex hormones. All right, so in this picture, we're looking at the main reproductive structure for females. Grab my pencil. And so starting off, you'll see here, you're going to have ovaries. There's going to be ovaries on each side. So you'll have a right and left ovary. These ovaries are going to be attached using ligaments. So you'll have a suspensory ligament right here, and then you'll have your ovarian ligament right here. So those are going to hold the ovaries in place. Now, at the edge of it, the lateral side to it, you're going to see this area here. That's a fiambre that's being pulled back in the picture on this side here. And so that's to show you that they're not actually attached to the ovaries. Now, over on this side, you can see how it comes down and it's going to kind of wrap around that ovary, and that's its job, is to catch the egg as it's coming out of the ovary after it's developed and being released. So it goes to these fiambre, and then from there it's going to travel through the uterine tube. Now these uterine tubes that you see here, these fallopian tubes, are going to be hollow tubes. So the fiambre catch the egg as it comes out of the ovary, and it's going to make its way down the uterine tube. Now the uterine tube is going to be very important because this is going to be the site of fertilization. So in order for the egg to be fertilized and be able to implant correctly, it needs to be fertilized in the uterine tube. So here you see the first section of that uterine tube coming out is referred to as the infundibulum. From the infundibulum, it's going to make its way down through the uterine tube and on its way to the uterus. With the development of the egg, once it becomes fertilized in the uterine tube, sometimes it can actually get stuck there, and that's what we refer to as an ectopic pregnancy. So it implants in the uterine tube, and as it goes through quite a few cellular divisions, within a week or two, it could actually cause the uterine tube to burst and the mother could hemorrhage. So that would be an emergency situation where you would need to go to the hospital to have it removed. Now, normally, under normal circumstances, it's going to continue to make its way through this uterine tube. Now, the uterine tube does have cells that have cilia in it, so those cilia are going to move in a rhythmic wave-like motion to send that egg through the uterine tube to the uterus. Now, with the uterus, it's going to be responsible for receiving that egg and for implantation. Now, another thing about the ovaries aren't just going to help to produce and to mature the egg, they're also going to be responsible for hormone production. Now, moving on to the uterus. Once it gets to the uterus, like we said, that's going to be the site for implantation. It's going to be a hollow muscular organ. It's going to be highly vascularized. And when it implants into the uterus, it's going to be able to grow things such as a placenta. So it has, it's a secretory organ, so it's going to have lots of glands, and those glands are going to be able to feed that embryo to help to develop that placenta to continue to feed the embryo up until it's ready to be born. Now, being a muscular organ, as that baby or embryo develops, it's going to be able to stretch and flex so that fetus can move around, and then once it's time for birth, it's going to be able to start contractions and to expel that baby so it can be born. Moving on down, you'll see that we have the cervix. The cervix is kind of like the bottom of the uterus. Cervix, of course, means neck, and so with the cervix, that's going to enter into the vaginal canal. There's an opening to the cervix, and if you look at it, that's called the external os. And this picture here, and that external os is going to basically be the birth canal. So as the baby develops, it will start to open up anywhere from several weeks to right prior to the birth of the baby. It will start to dilate and open up in order for the baby to be able to come out. And so if you go to the doctor, they will continue to keep track of this and measure how much it has dilated. The cervix, like we said, leads into the vaginal canal. That vaginal canal is also going to be a muscular structure. It's going to have rugae there, and that's going to help to expand and flex in order to allow the penis to come in. Also, looking here, you can see that you have ureters here. These ureters are going to be tucked in behind that broad ligament. All of these ligaments are going to help to keep everything in place. So when you're moving around, walking, exercising, running, doing things like that, that everything's not just moving around inside of you. Here's another picture. So this is looking at it. It's going to open it up so you can actually see the inside of that hollow tube. My pencil. And so you see inside of these ovaries, you'll see the production of the oocytes, and you'll see these starting to produce the eggs going through their different cycles there. So you have your primordial follicles. You see those fambrae, which are going to catch the egg as it comes out. You see that it goes into the first section, which is called the infundibulum of the fallopian tube, comes through what's known as the ampulla into the isthmus. Now, with those cells, like we said, they are going to have cilia, which is going to help to move that egg along, and the fertilization does occur within the uterine tube. So then it makes its way to the uterus. Looking at the uterus, here they have it cut open so you can see the hollow inside, but then you can also see the muscular structure. So that's going to be called your myometrium, that muscular section that you're going to find through the center portion there. The endometrium is going to be that inner lining that you see inside of the uterus. So that's referred to as the endometrium. And then, of course, you're going to have your uterine cavity, which is going to be the opening inside of that area. All right. The outer portion that is going to go along the outside is going to be referred to as the parametrium. Now, moving along, if it does not implant in the uterus somewhere, it will make its way towards the cervix and out of the body. So you have what's called the internal os or opening that's going to be starting going through that cervical canal. Then you have your external os. Now with this, if you noticed in the last picture, it looks like a circle. But if a woman has had a child, been pregnant and had a child, it will look like a slit. So they can go in and they can look and they can tell if a woman has been pregnant before or not, because it will turn into a slit instead of a nice, perfect little circle. All right, so coming through that cervix, through the external os, it would go into what we call the vaginal canal. Now, the vaginal canal is also going to be a muscular structure. It has rugate. It allows it to expand into flex to allow for the accommodation of not only the penis, but for the baby to come through and to be born. So this here is going to be a sagittal section that you're looking at. So to orient yourself, this would be, give it a minute. This will be the front of the body. And so the first thing that you will see is going to be this urinary bladder. You've got the urethra, and you've got the outer portion in which you would urinate. So that's your external urethral orifice. Next, in the center portion, you're going to have your uterus. You will see you have your ovary, you have your fallopian tube or uterine tube, you'll have the cervix here, and then you'll have the vagina. And then behind that, you'll see the rectal area. And so you have the rectum in this area and then the anus. And so some people don't understand the order or how things are made up. And it simply goes from the bladder urethra, then you have your vagina, and then behind that you will have the anus. So primary sex organs for the female reproductive system. The primary sexual organs are going to be the gonads, and for females, that will be the ovaries. Now the ovaries are going to be solid ovoid structures that are going to be located within the lateral pelvic cavity. The ovaries are going to be subdivided into a medulla, which is going to be the center portion, and the outer portion, which is referred to as the cortex. Now, these are terms that we've used quite a bit with many other organs. The last one you could probably think of was with the urinary system when we were talking about the kidney. Now, the medulla is going to be made up of connective tissue. It's also going to have a lot of blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves that are coming into it. The cortex, however, is going to contain the follicles. During prenatal development, small groups of cells from millions of these primordial follicles, each which consist of primary oocytes, are going to be surrounded by follicular cells. So early in development, the primary oocyte will begin to undergo meiosis. But that process is going to halt and doesn't resume until puberty. So you start out with a regular egg containing 46 chromosomes. Remember, you got all those millions of primordial follicles, and it's going to undergo meiosis, and then it stops. And the reason that we undergo meiosis is because you need to get the chromosome number down from 46 to 23. By the time that the female reaches puberty, only about 40,000 of those oocytes are going to remain. So remember, you started out with millions and millions of those primordial follicles. Now we're down to about 40,000 that are remaining. So at puberty, these will start to reactivate, but only about 400 of these are actually going to be released from the ovary during the reproductive life cycle of that female. So oogenesis is going to be the production and maturation of the oocytes or of the egg. So beginning at puberty, some of those oocytes are going to be stimulated to continue on with their meiosis. When the primary oocyte undergoes meiosis, it's going to give rise to a large haploid secondary and a polar body. So you get a secondary oocyte, which is going to be larger than the polar body. The polar body is going to take some of those chromosomes off to the side because we don't need that extra genetic material. Remember, we're trying to reduce the number. A secondary unequal cytoplasmic division is going to occur, and it's going to give rise to an egg cell and another polar body. And so with this, it's going to get all of the good stuff into this one main egg cell, and the polar body is going to disintegrate and break down, and it's going to be dissolved by the body. So the egg is going to be much larger than those polar bodies were. It's going to have all the extra cytoplasm in it, organelles, and everything that that egg is going to need to develop later on into a fetus. And so here is looking at a picture of what we just discussed. Move this over, sorry. And so we're starting out with the primary oocyte. it's going to have 46 chromosomes. It's going to go through meiosis. It's going to create what we see down here as a first polar body. So it creates that here, and then you get your secondary oocyte. From there, that secondary oocyte is going to go through meiosis again, and it's going to end up creating an egg, and it's going to create another polar body. So once we create that egg, the egg is then able to be fertilized. It has 23 chromosomes in it, and the sperm coming in also has 23 chromosomes, and therefore 46 chromosomes when they come together makes a viable human person. Now, each one of our cells or somatic cells has 46 chromosomes, but remember the gametes are only going to have 23 chromosomes each. So they have one set or a haploid set. And you notice over to the side here, you will see that these polar bodies do break down and dissolve, and all the stuff's going to be reabsorbed by the body. Here's another picture looking at it. So mitosis during early fetal life is going to give rise to these primary oocytes. So you see we start off as an oogonium, kind of like the spermatogonium. And that oogonium goes through mitosis and creates that primary oocyte. So during its first phase, meiosis 1, it's going to go through a division during fetal development. And after puberty, the primary oocyte will complete this meiosis 1. Which produces a secondary oocyte. The first polar body that may or may not divide again will kind of dissolve and break down. The secondary oocyte is then going to begin meiosis 2. That secondary oocyte and first polar body is going to be ovulated. And after fertilization, if it comes in contact with a sperm, fertilization occurs, and after that, that oocyte will split into an ovum and a second polar body. The nuclei, when it comes in there from that sperm, is going to fuse with the nuclei of the ovum, and then it goes from 23 chromosomes to 46. And here is another picture just looking at everything that we talked about. So each month after puberty, FSH, or the follicle-stimulating hormone, is going to initiate maturation of a few of these primordial follicles. And so as these primordial follicles become initiated, they're going to start to mature. And so some might start 1 week, some might start later on. And so these follicles are continuously maturing, and it takes about a year for them to mature. These follicles, as they mature, are going to enlarge, and then the follicular cells that surround them are going to proliferate, and a primary follicle is going to form. Further development is going to produce a secondary follicle, which contains a primary oocyte. And that's going to be surrounded by a zona pellucida, which is basically going to be a protein protective layer. Also, it's going to be surrounded by a corona rhodata, which is going to be a layer of granular cells, which are often referred to as granulosa cells. To form a mature follicle, which is going to be often referred to as a graphian, that primary oocyte is going to complete meiosis 1, and it starts to begin meiosis 2, but it stops kind of in the midway point at metaphase. And it's going to stay at that stopped metaphase point until or if it becomes fertilized. Once it becomes fertilized, then it will continue through meiosis 2, divide, create a polar body, and then go on to create the embryo. But up until that point, it does not go past metaphase of meiosis 2. So this picture is showing you basically what it looks like. You have your primary oocyte in the center. You're going to have these follicular cells, which are going around the edge here. Notice how they're few in number, very thin. They have that basement membrane. You see the stromal cells and some collagen fibers, which are kind of keeping it in place, keeping everything where it needs to be. Then here you're going to see how the primary oocyte is still going to be in the center, but now we have a zona pellucida. That zona pellucida is going to be that protein layer that's going around and protecting and surrounding the primary oocyte. You notice how those cells, the granulosal cells, have actually changed and now they proliferated. Remember, exit drawing. Remember, back at this picture here, you have those follicular cells, which are the granulosa cells. Notice how few they are in number, how close that basement membrane is. Looking at this picture, you can see how they proliferated, how you have a lot of those there. It's pushed that basement membrane away, and you see it start to develop. Of course, on the outside, you still see that you have your collagen fibers, and you have your protective layer on the outside. So here it's showing you as it goes into the secondary follicle stage. With the secondary follicle stage, you can see that now you have some fluid that's starting to develop over here in this area. You notice that you still have your primary oocyte to the center. You're going to have those granulosa cells that have proliferated and started to expand even more. You have created that opening there. You still have your basement membrane that's going around the edge. And then those cells that kind of stay close and around there is going to be that corona radiata. And so those are going to be the ones that kind of stay around and protected. Going into the next view, this is what it actually looks like underneath the microscope. So you see that primary oocyte, you see that zona pellucida, which is going to be that protein layer that's there as a protection layer. You see the corona radiata, and then the secondary follicle of the granulosa cells going around. And then you see the antrum that's going to be filled with follicular fluid there. Now here is going to be a section of the ovaries cortex. And so the cortex is going to be the main sections that we see through here. Of course, the medulla is going to be further on down. And so looking at this, it shows you many different follicles that are going to be in many different stages of development here. And so you have that germinal epithelium that's going to be going around the outer portion of that ovary. You see a primary follicle right here that's starting to develop with granulosa cells. You're going to see a primary oocyte that's developing in here with a secondary follicle that's going around it. You can also look around and see some of these follicles that have already developed, like this one here, and released its egg. And so this one also, so those are going to be corpus luteums. And so with those, that's what it looks like after it has developed its egg, it's released its egg, and it's starting to dissolve back down. Now, with that, usually one of these will completely develop and release an egg each month. Every now and then, sometimes it can release more than one egg each month, but usually on average, you get the release of one egg a month. And so here is a mature follicle, and that's going to be called a graphian. And so with that, you notice that there is a nice big fluid-filled space there. You still have that zona pellucida that's going around the primary oocyte. You have the corona radiata that's going to be there, then the basement membrane surrounding it all. And then on the outer portion of that, you do see those collagen fibers. You're going to see the follicular cells that are going around the outer portion. Now with ovulation, that's going to be a process which releases the secondary oocyte from the surface of the ovary. This is going to be stimulated by luteinizing hormone. So the ovulated secondary oocyte, surrounded by the corona radiata and the zona pellucida, is then going to move towards the uterine tube. So we see here, it's going to start out over to the side here as this primordial follicle. It's going to continue to develop. It becomes a primary follicle, and then it's going to move over. You see those follicular cells starting to develop around it with that primary oocyte in the center. Then you start to see that follicular fluid form inside. And then once it has completely developed, you then go through ovulation. It kind of bursts and releases that egg. You see the fimbriae, which are going to be these structures here. They're kind of wrapped or going around that ovary. They're going to catch that egg when it's released, and then it gets released into the uterine tube. And so you see that secondary oocyte that's still going to have the zona pellucida protein layer around it. It has its corona radiata, and it's got that first little polar body off to the side there. So here is another view or another artist's rendition of what's going on. So starting out on top with that primary follicle, primordial follicle, which then develops into a primary follicle, then a secondary follicle, and then it changes over and you see that follicular fluid starting to build up, becomes a mature follicle. Eventually it bursts, it releases that egg. That's during ovulation. So that oocyte is going to be released into the uterine tube, and then it's going to travel down the uterine tube towards the uterus. Now, after that egg is released, you're going to end up with a structure called a corpus luteum. Inside that corpus luteum, you'll see that a blood clot is starting to form, and it slowly starts to disintegrate and then becomes dissolved. Right before it completely dissolves, it becomes what's called a corpus albicans. It's here for now. So if the female internal accessory organs are going to consist of a pair of uterine tubes, a uterus, and a vagina. The uterine tubes are going to connect with the oviducts. They are suspended by broad ligaments, and they're going to lead to the uterus. So uterine tubes are oviducts. You can also hear them called fallopian tubes. They're right there connected with the ovaries. And so they're going to take that egg to the uterus. Near each ovary, that uterine tube is going to expand and form what's known as an infundibulum with fimbriae. That's going to be those little finger-like projections that are going around that ovary. And that's going to be found at the margins. So the uterine tubes are going to have 3 layers. It's going to have a mucosa, a muscularis, and a serosa. The simple ciliated columnar epithelium of that mucosa is going to contain cilia that's going to move the fertilized ovum or secondary oocyte towards the uterus. Peg cells are going to be in this tube, and they're going to secrete a fluid that provides nourishment to the ovum as it's moving through these tubes. So in this picture, it's showing you a transverse plane of the uterine tube. So when you're looking at it, you're going to look at the cilia that's going to be on the top portion there. So the cilia here is what's going to help to move that egg along through the uterine tube. Of course, you have your peg cells, which are going to be these cells here. And those are going to be cells that secrete nourishment that's going to be able to feed that embryo until it reaches the uterus, and it can implant and actually be nourished by the uterus at that point. And so these cilia, also notice that they're going to be on these columnar cells there. And it's simple columnar, so that means it's going to be 1 layer. And they have the cilia, which are going to move in a wave-like motion to move that egg along the uterus or fallopian or uterine tube until it makes it to the uterus. In the center portion of that connective tissue, you'll see, of course, that lamina propria. Now, the uterus is going to be the upper 2/3 of what's in the uterine cavity. The body is going to have a dome-shaped top to it, or sometimes people refer to it as a pear shape. The lower 1/3 of the uterus is considered to be the cervix, and that's going to extend into the vagina. Histologically, there's going to be 3 layers to the uterus. You have what's called the perimetrium, or also known as the serosa. That's going to be the outermost layer. Remember, peri means around, so this is going to be the layer that's around. You'll have your middle layer. That's going to be the myometrium. That's going to consist of 3 layers of smooth muscle. Remember, smooth muscle isn't under voluntary control, so it is controlled by the nervous system. Then you have what's called the endometrium. The endometrium is going to be that inner layer. It's going to be a stratum functionalis layer. And so that's the layer that's going to be shed each month during menstruation. So it starts to build up throughout the month. And then once you reach that cycle and the egg is there, it will, if it does not implant, then it will shed through the menstruation. Then underneath, you're going to have that stratum basalis layer, which is going to be a basic stratum basal layer. And that's permanent. And that's the layer that is not going to shed, but is going to remain there, and it's going to give rise to a new stratum functionalis each month. And so it slowly starts to build up throughout the month, and as it builds up, once it reaches time for the cycle to be shed, it will shed it, but it keeps that stratum basalis layer. And so here, looking at this, you're going to see the basic structure there. So you've got the body of the uterus, which is going to be found on the top here. You can see that cut into the different layers. So the inner portion is going to be the endometrium. This is going to have your stratum functionalis, which you will shed each month. You have the 3 layers of smooth muscle, which is going to be that myometrium. And then you'll have that outer layer, which is going to be the perimetrium. Coming down to the lower third, you have the cervix. the cervical orifice, which is going to be an opening, and then it opens into the vagina. This is looking at it through a microscope slide. So you see the lumen, which is going to be the opening. You've got that endometrium, which is going to be that inner lining that's going to build up and shed. You've got the myometrium and then the perimetrium here. And here we go again with more of a microscope slide showing a little bit more. So you see that perimetrium going around the outer portion. You see the thick layer of muscle, which is going to be your myometrium. That stratum basalis layer, which is going to be the stratum basal layer that stays there and will build up and push outwards. That, along with that stratum functionalis, those are the cells that are being pushed up, are both going to make up that endometrial layer. So remember, the basalis layer stays, only the functionalis layer is going to be the layer that's shed during menstruation. So the vagina. The vagina is going to be a fibromuscular tube that extends from the uterus to the outside. The vaginal orifice is partially covered by a membrane called the hymen. Now the hymen is going to be a thin fold of vascularized mucous membrane that's going to be partially there to close or partially closes the inferior end of the vagina. So the vaginal wall will consist of 3 layers. It's going to have the inner mucosal layer, the middle muscular layer, and then the outer fibrous layer. And so looking here, you'll see that lumen, which is going to be the opening in the side of the vagina. You have the mucosa, which is going to be made up of non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Underneath that, you have what's called the lamina propria, and then you go into the muscularis layer. So you'll have the outer circular layer, and then the inner longitudinal layer. And then beneath that, you have that adventitia. And here you are looking at another view. This shows you how well vascularized that the uterus is going to be, and it shows all the different vessels that are going in through that muscular layer, through that myometrium, and radiating into the endometrium. On the side there, you see that you have an endometrial gland, and with that endometrial gland there, it's going to help to prepare and feed that stratum functionalis and the stratum basalis. And so you see the arteries going in that are feeding that area. So this procedure here is showing pap smear. Now, what they're doing with the pap smear is they go in with the and they'll take a swab and they'll swab the cervix during a normal gynecological visit. And when they're swabbing the cervix, what they're doing is they're trying to get some cells from the cervix. They'll then take those cells from the cervix and they'll put it on a slide and they'll stain the slide. So then you'll have a cytologist or a histologist look at that, and they will try to determine if those cells look healthy or if they look like something's funny with it. If it looks like it could be cancerous cells. Also with that, they can go in and swab and they can do some test for HPV. Now, HPV, the human papillomavirus, is going to be the virus that is the major cause of cervical cancers. Now, with cervical cancers, this virus is going to be fairly common. Most of the time, it is asymptomatic in males, and so they might not realize that they even have HPV. And if you have unprotected sex with your partner, then you could easily contract this virus and not even know it. So that's why it's important to get a yearly exam where they go in and they do a pap smear and do a swab. So what they're looking for, looking at these cells, these are going to be cells that they have stained, and these are going to be nice layers of squamous cells. So they're nice, they're poofy. You notice that the nucleus looks great. Now looking over here at this picture that's going to be at the top, notice the cells that have an enlarged nucleus. So these darker cells here are going to be the cells they're looking for. So these cells, the nucleus is really big. They don't quite have this nice puffy look to them. They don't look nice and healthy. And so this is going to be a sign that there could be cancerous cells there. And so from there, they would want to go in and do a biopsy. And so with that, there are some things that they could do. One, you could actually have an HPV, what you call vaccine that is out now. It's given to both males and females. They're hoping to cut back and reduce the chances of getting things such as cervical cancer. They could go in and they could take portions or burn off portions of the cervix. Maybe if there are genital warts there, they could burn off those genital warts and hopefully save that person's life, or go in if they have to and do a hysterectomy. All right. So now we're going into the female external reproductive organs. The external organs of the female reproductive system are going to be the vulva, and that's going to include the mons pubis, the labia majora, the labia minora, the clitoris, and the vestibular glands. Now, with that mons pubis, it's going to be composed mainly of adipose tissue, which is going to help to cushion that pubic symphysis. Remember, the pubic symphysis back from the skeletal unit is going to be that area that's going to be found right in the middle where both coxa come together. The labia majora is going to enclose and protect the other external reproductive organs, and they're going to correspond to the scrotum of the male. The labia minora is going to be a flattened longitudinal fold between the labia majora and form a hood that's going to surround the clitoris. Many blood vessels are going to cause the labia minora to appear to be pink. The clitoris is going to be a mass of erectile tissue at the anterior end of the vulva between the labia minora. The clitoris is going to correspond to the penis and is going to have a similar structure. The vestibule is going to be a space that's going to be enclosed by the labia minora. Within this space, there's going to be a hymen, a vaginal orifice, external urethral orifice, and openings to ducts of several different glands. A pair of vestibular glands is going to lie on either side of the vaginal opening, and these are going to be homologous to those bulbourethral glands. And so these glands are going to produce mucus during sexual arousal to help provide lubrication. Now, you're going to have what's called paraurethral or Skene's glands. These are going to secrete mucus and are going to be embedded in the wall of the urethra. They're going to be homologous to the prostate. The bulb of the vestibule is going to have two masses of erectile tissue that are going to engorge during sexual arousal, and they're going to narrow that vaginal orifice and apply pressure to the penis during intercourse. These masses of erectile tissue are going to be homologous to the erectile tissue of the penis. So looking here, you can see you've got that labia majora. It's going to be the open part. They have it spread. You have your labia minora towards the inner section. You're going to have the hymen, which is going to help to cover part of the opening of the vagina. You're going to have the prepuce of the clitoris, and then the clitoris underneath. So it's creating a hood over the clitoris. And you have the external urethral orifice, and then the vaginal orifice. And here's another picture showing the muscular structure and makeup there. And so you can see how the different muscles are going to connect. In this chart, it's going to show you some summary of homologous structures of the female and male reproductive. So with the females, the gonads are going to be the ovaries. With the males, it's going to be testes. The ovum is going to be the female reproductive cell. The sperm is going to be the male reproductive cell. We have the labia majora, which is going to be the same as the scrotum. The labia minora is going to be like the spongy urethra. The vestibule is going to be like the intermediate urethra. And then you have the bulb of the vestibule, which is going to be like the corpus spongiosum of the penis and the bulb of the penis. Now coming down, you have the clitoris, which is going to be homologous to the glans penis and the corpora cavernosa. You have your paraurethral glands, which are going to be homologous to the prostate, and greater vestibular glands, which are going to be homologous to the bulbourethral glands. Now, erection, lubrication, and orgasm. So during periods of sexual stimulation, the erectile tissue of the clitoris and the vestibular bulbs become engorged with blood. The vestibular glands are going to secrete a mucus into the vestibule and the vagina. During orgasm, the muscles of the perineum, uterine wall, and uterine tubes are going to contract rhythmically. Hormonal control in female reproductive function. So the hormones secreted by the hypothalamus in the anterior pituitary and the ovaries will control the female reproduction and development of secondary sexual characteristics. Female sex hormones are going to start at right around 10 years of age. That hypothalamus is going to begin to secrete more gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which in turn is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary to release luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. So at puberty, the ovaries then are going to synthesize estrogens in response to follicle-stimulating hormone. These estrogens are going to be responsible for the female secondary sexual characteristics such as breast development. You'll have increased adipose tissue and tissue deposits in specific places, increased vascularization of the skin. Ovaries are also going to start to secrete progesterone, which is going to trigger uterine changes during a menstrual cycle. So the female reproductive cycle, often referred to as the menstrual cycle, is going to be characterized by monthly changes in the uterine lining that are going to lead to menstrual flow as the endometrium is shed. A menstrual cycle is going to be started by follicle-stimulating hormone, which stimulates the maturation of a follicle in the ovary. Follicular cells that surround the developing oocyte are going to secrete estrogen, which is going to be responsible for maintaining secondary sexual characteristics as well as thickening of the uterine lining. Ovulation is then going to be triggered by a mid-cycle surge of luteinizing hormone. Following ovulation, the follicular cells are going to turn into glandular corpus luteum that's going to secrete increasing amounts of estrogen and progesterone. So if pregnancy occurs, or pregnancy does not occur, the corpus luteum is going to start to degenerate. Hormone levels here are going to start to decline, and the uterine lining will then start to disintegrate, and it will be shed with that monthly menstrual cycle. And so looking here, you will see with the different hormones that are being released, following along with the days in the cycle, and you can see at the bottom the endometrium lining that will be shed. And so LH and FSH through the developing follicle. And so as you get closer to ovulation, you see how they are going to spike. Estrogens and progesterone also spike around that time. And notice how that uterine lining is starting to become thicker and thicker. And so here's showing you just a breakdown of what's being released and what's happening. So you have the hypothalamus secreting the gonadotropin releasing hormone that goes and activates the anterior pituitary. FSH here is then going to come over and it's going to stimulate growing follicles and initial development of ovarian follicles. And so with that, then we're going to have FSH also stimulating the ovaries. So you'll have LH or luteinizing hormone coming out and stimulating that corpus luteum over there. So as these come in and start to stimulate, you see ovulation and further development of ovarian follicles and their secretions of estrogen and inhibin. And so from that, estrogen is produced. That estrogen is going to promote development and maintenance of female reproductive structures, feminine secondary sex characteristics, and breast. It increases the protein that called protein anabolism, which means it's going to create and make proteins for the body, lower blood cholesterols, and moderate levels that inhibit the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, FSH, and LH. Now, also coming over with your corpus luteum, that secretion of progesterone there and estrogens and relaxin, and inhibin from that corpus luteum is going to come in and make or produce progesterone that's going to work with estrogens to prepare the endometrium for implantation. So if the egg becomes fertilized in the uterine tube, this is going to help it to implant into the uterus. It helps to prepare the mammary glands to start secreting milk, and is going to inhibit the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone and luteinizing hormone. With this corpus luteum, also it can come in with relaxin, and it's going to inhibit the contractions of the uterus smooth muscle. It's also, during labor, going to increase flexibility of the pubic symphysis and help to dilate the uterine cervix. And then with the inhibin, both can be activated both by the ovaries developing, and then that corpus luteum. So it comes in and it's going to inhibit the release of FSH and, to lesser extent, luteinizing hormone. Now moving on to menopause. Your menstrual cycle as a female will continue throughout middle age until menopause, and this is going to be when that cycle ceases. The cause of menopause is going to be the aging of the ovaries, and so this is when the follicles are going to be no longer maturing and estrogen levels are going to start to decline. Mammary glands are going to be accessory organs that are specialized to produce and secrete milk after pregnancy. Mammary glands are going to be modified sweat glands, and they're going to be located within each of the breasts. A mammary gland is going to consist anywhere from 15 to 30 lobes, and it's going to be made up of a dense connective tissue and fat, which is going to separate each one of these lobes. So each lobe is going to have lobules that contain milk-secreting glands called alveoli, kind of like with the lungs. Each breast is going to have a nipple that contains lactiferous ducts, which milk is going to emerge from. So the nipples are going to be surrounded by a pigmented skin called the areola, and that skin is going to be a darker pigmentation, they say, in order to help the baby to find their food source. So looking here, this is going to show you a visual of that tissue that's going to be found within the mammary area. So you have suspensory ligaments of the breast that's going to actually help to hold the breast into place. They are also referred to as Cooper's ligaments. You have the pectoralis major muscle that you're going to find underneath the adipose tissue and the glands. You have the lobule containing alveoli, which are going to be the circular openings to those mammary glands. You're going to have the secondary tubules. You have the mammary ducts. You have the lactiferous sinus, which is going to be an opening that milk's going to travel to. Then it goes into the lactiferous ducts, and it will exit out through the nipple. Now the areola is going to be the darkened area that's going to be around the nipple. Contraception. So there's several different ways that you can prevent the fertilization of an egg. You can have behavioral methods such as abstinence. That's where you refrain from having sexual intercourse altogether. You can have what they refer to as coitus interruptus. That's where you do not go through orgasm. And so that one still sometimes there could be some sperm that seep out during pre-ejaculation. So there's still a chance that becoming pregnant could occur. Or they have what's called a rhythm method, which is going to be temporary abstinence during ovulation periods. You could have surgical or burial methods. These are going to be things such as a condom that will keep the sperm inside of a package so it does not enter the vaginal canal and doesn't go in through the cervix and make it to the uterine tube in order to fertilize the egg. You could have a vasectomy. That's where they go in and they cut that vas deferens, and they usually cauterize it, and they will clamp it off or tie it off or suture it. You could have a tubal ligation. That's the same thing pretty much, but they go into the fallopian or uterine tubes. They usually can cut those. Lots of times they will clamp them, suture them, tie them, and then they cauterize them or burn them to keep them from growing back. But even with the vasectomy and tubal ligation, you still have a chance because sometimes things do grow back together because the body's a wonderful organism that's able to heal itself. With condoms, sometimes they break. So you have to be prepared if you have sexual intercourse to take on that responsibility. So some non-incisional sterilization methods that you could use. There's what's called a micro-insert coil that is made of a plastic or metals that sometimes can be used to be inserted into the uterine tube. That would cause scar tissue and growth to build up around it, and that will cause a blockage of the uterine tubes. So the body is still producing eggs, but those eggs cannot make it past that point from where that scar tissue was developed. There are barrier methods, like we said, the male condom. We've got the vaginal pouch, that's going to be referred to as the female condom. You could have a diaphragm. You can have a cervical cap. All of these things are going to basically close off either the male reproductive organ or the cervix portion of the female reproductive organs. You can have a intrauterine device, which is called an IUD. There's going to be several different types of these. They usually work They'll last anywhere from 5 to 10 years, depending on what type you have. One type works by blocking sperm from entering the uterine tube, so it kind of looks like a little Y. Some of them will go in, and there are some devices that could be put into the cervix, but most of the time they actually go in and they will face like a Y, and one end will block each one of the uterine tubes. And so this is what the IUD looks like. And so you go in and it's inserted by a physician. And when they leave it in, of course, the main portion, the intrauterine long section, usually contains different types of hormones in it, so that helps to regulate the system. With this, like I said, some of them last 5 years, some of them last 10 years. There's going to be chemical methods. So you have birth control pills. There's many, many different types. Packets usually come with 28 tablets. The first 20 through 21 tablets are going to have small quantities of estrogen and progesterone. These are going to stimulate pregnancy. So this will keep the body from having a menstrual cycle. The last tablets are going to be hormone-free, and this is going to allow for the reduced menstrual flow, and it doesn't allow for ovarian follicles to develop. So you will still have a period, but you will not be releasing an egg. With these, you have to be very specific when you take them. They need to be taken the exact time every single day. Spermicides can be used, things like naloxone 9. That's usually going to be used alongside barrier methods like the sponge, a condom, diaphragm, and cervical caps. Spermicides are going to be inserted into the vaginal canal, and they will kill sperm. Looking here, this is going to show you the failure rates with perfect use versus typical use for each one of these methods. So you can take a look at these, stop the video, compare the different ones. Some sexually transmitted diseases or infections. So you can have different types of bacterial infections that you can catch. One is gonorrhea, the other is syphilis, and the third one on here is chlamydia. So with these, they are treatable by antibiotics. Sorry, I had to grab some water. Okay, so with the bacterial infections, they are treatable through antibiotics, but we do urge caution because even though you might not get pregnant, you're taking other forms of birth control, they will not protect you against these different bacterial infections unless you're using like a female or a male condom. You can have a protistal STD, like trichomoniasis. And this one is one that usually isn't going to be prevalent, or you won't actually see it in men, so it's going to be asymptomatic, but you will have symptoms in a female. And then you have your viral infections that you could get. And so with the viral infections, you could have the human papillomavirus, which will cause genital warts, which could lead to cervical cancer, things like that. So that's one that we do have a vaccine against. And then genital herpes, which is going to be the human herpes virus type 2. So these are also going to be fairly common and spread easily. So with these, even though you might be using a anti-pregnancy method, it will not help against contracting these if it's not a barrier method. All right, so that's going to finish this up for the human reproductive system. I will see you for our last section on human development.